بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So last week we talked about extensively about the persecution of the Sahaba and also but mainly the persecution of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We also talked about why were the believers tested. Why were the believers tested? What was the wisdom behind Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's testing the believers? Why not just protect the believers and make Islam spread and give them victory? What was the purpose that the Prophet, the greatest man to walk the earth, the most beloved person to Allah, what was the wisdom behind him being tortured? Why couldn't Allah just send Jibreel and the angels to come and help him and protect him and basically wipe out anyone that stood in front of him? We mentioned many wisdom. We mentioned how that through these struggles their status with Allah would be raised. We also mentioned that through these kinds of trials and tribulations that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is testing those believers. So we mentioned a few points. We also talked about the house of Al-Arqam, where the Muslims would gather in order for them to go ahead and learn more about their Islam. So it is like an institute. It is an institute where the Sahaba would gather. And we mentioned why did the Prophet ﷺ chose that house. Now let's move on to another very important event. Another important event that took place in Mecca, and that is the immigration. Now, this immigration happened in the year 5 years after prophethood. So when the Prophet ﷺ became a prophet, 5 years. Now remember, the da'wah, open da'wah, happened 3 years after the da'wah. So you could see that within a span of 2 years, 1.5 years, the Muslims were feeling the persecution to such an extent that they had to look for a safe haven. They had to look for a place where they could go and seek refuge over there. So they can go and seek refuge there. Now, this happened after the fact when the torture and humiliation was actually increasing for the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba. So as a matter of fact, even Umar radiallahu anhu, who was not a Muslim at that time, one of the people that was going there was migrating to Abyssinia. He asked, he said, "Where are you guys going?" He said, "We are going to Abyssinia because you people," and Umar was not a Muslim, "have made our lives very hard for us here, that we cannot survive. We cannot survive here anymore. Like, we have to go and find another land where we can freely worship Allah." And even Umar, he was so shocked by this. And Umar, he showed compassion, and he would say, has it become so bad that you guys have to leave your own country? And it was not something that was very easy. And he actually even made dua for those people. He said, "May Allah be with you. May Allah be with you." So the Prophet ﷺ, he suggested to the Sahaba that they move to a place called Habasha. And this land, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, this land, meaning Mecca, has become too constricted for you. So for those of you who want to, why don't you immigrate to the neighboring land of Abyssinia? For there is a Christian king who is a just king, and he shall allow you to worship without interference. And this was in Rajab, which is 2 months before Ramadan, in the 5th year of the da'wah, in the 5th year after prophethood. So the Prophet ﷺ, he gave permission to these Sahaba, and there are various reports about how many people migrated in the first migration. So some said there were uh, 15, and others said that there was 60. But I mean, it's not a big deal. Um, how many people there were, but just it's a very small number of people that decided to go ahead and migrate. So the Prophet ﷺ gave this command, and there were about 16 people, 15, 16 people, 11 men or 12 men, and 4 women. Now, among them was Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu, who was the um, son-in-law. He is the son-in-law of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, he was married to the daughter of the Prophet ﷺ, and her name was Ruqayya. Her name was Ruqayya. So Uthman radiallahu anhu is amongst the 12 people that are migrating, along with his wife Ruqayya, the daughter of the Prophet ﷺ. And he was accompanied by Abdurrahman ibn Auf. Abdurrahman ibn Auf. Now, so far, you have these 2 major business individuals who are leaving Mecca. They're 2 big people. They're very, very influential, and they're very rich, and they're one of the respectable merchants of Mecca. So just these 2 individuals. Then you have Uthman ibn Maz'un. You have Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, who's also the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ. And these are very high caliber Sahaba. So then you have Mus'ab ibn Umair. Mus'ab ibn Umair, he was also the first ambassador in Islam. He was the first ambassador in Islam. He was the first person to migrate to Medina as well, even before the Prophet ﷺ. And then we have Abu Salama and his wife Salama. Salama later on becomes the wife of the Prophet ﷺ when her husband dies, and a number of other Sahaba. So they all migrated to Abyssinia. Now, there's some reports that they migrated secretly, and others said no, it was very open. They didn't hide it from anyone if anyone had asked. And we mentioned the story of Umar radiallahu anhu, in which when he saw one of his clanswomen and they're packing up and they're leaving, they're saying, he asked them, where are you guys going? And she said that this is all because of what you guys are doing to us, persecuting us, and you are not leaving us alone to go ahead and worship our Allah. So now we have to go and find somewhere else to go. So even Umar, he was very, very shocked. So this was unlike the migration, the second migration, and also unlike the migration to Medina, where the Prophet ﷺ and even some of the Sahaba had to go and migrate in secret. So let me just show you their migration. Okay, so this is Makkah right here. So they would go, so Medina is here, right? So when they would go to Medina, they would just go up north. But when they are going to Aksum, Aksum is actually the name of the place. This whole region is called Habasha. This whole region. So the city that they were going to, or rather the civilization, and you could also type that in Google, Aksum, okay, A-K-S-U-M, that was a civilization here. This was a very prosperous, a very rich civilization. So these people actually were were doing very, very well, both economically and politically. They were very stable in terms of politics. They had a just king who went ahead because of his justice. He had brought about peace, and he brought about economic prosperity. And that is what justice does, right? Not only does it bring security, but it also brings other prosperity as well. So you had people who were looking up to these, to the people or the civilization of Aksum. So you had the Sahaba, the people from Makkah, going, what is it, westward, a little bit west, northwest, to a city called Jeddah. Now, this is now called Jeddah. Before it was called Jeddah, and that was the seaport. Even right now, that's where the seaport is, right? So Jeddah or Jeddah. So they went there, and then they went all the way down. Either they came here and then went by foot or by caravan, or they migrated all the way down to Aksum. Now this is modern day Ethiopia. Aksum is located in modern day Ethiopia, but Habasha is considered to be a region that is that encompasses Sudan, South Egypt, Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia. So that region is called Habasha. Just like Arabia. Arabia, it doesn't only mean Saudi Arabia. Arabia, it encompasses a whole wide of region. Just like when we say Malaya land, it's not only Malaysia. I think it encompasses Indonesia and Singapore and other parts. It just means that that is where the people of Malays or the people of the Arab people they live. In any case, so the Prophet ﷺ, he gave permission to anyone who wanted to migrate to go ahead and migrate. So the Prophet ﷺ gave that permission to, but now only the affluent and the people that could afford to migrate, they migrated. Okay, those people who could migrate, they could migrate, and those people who were slaves or who were poor people, they could not migrate because they couldn't afford to do so. Migration is not something that's easy. It's not something that anyone can just pick up their bags and some money and leave. Some people didn't have ownership of their own selves. They didn't own their own bodies. So for example, like Bilal, Khabbab, Ibn Mas'ud, Ammar, these people, they couldn't do so even though they wanted to do so. Okay, they wanted to do so. So because they knew that the Quraysh would prevent them, they would go ahead and chase after them to get their property back. And the other reason is it's not cheap to migrate. It costs money. How are you going to pay for it? How are you going to resettle in the country? It takes a lot of resources to go ahead and migrate from one country to another country for the sake of Allah. It's not easy. It's not easy. So that's why the Prophet ﷺ, he gave like permission, whoever can. He didn't make it fard. As opposed to Medina. Medina, it was like almost wajib. You had to migrate. And the reason was because it was fairly easy compared to, not easy in a sense, easy like, you know, both the distance and also it was doable. But there came a time where the Prophet ﷺ, he forbade people from staying behind in Mecca without a valid reason. Why? Because we are not allowed to live in the lands of the non-Muslims or in the lands of those people who are at war with the Muslims. It is not permissible. Now, what are some of the benefits that we can derive from the Muslims from the Muslims in or rather, what was the wisdom behind why Abyssinia was chosen by the Prophet ﷺ. What was the wisdom? Well, first of all, the Prophet ﷺ, he specifically mentioned that you go there because there is a just king. The king of Abyssinia, he was a just king that allowed freedom of worship, that was just and didn't persecute people based upon their religion. So it tells us how important justice is, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will help an individual, even if he is not a Muslim, but if he is just, Allah will help him to prosper. Not only if he is an individual, Allah will help him to be successful and help him to prosper. And if he is acting in the capacity of a king, Allah will make his country, his people to prosper. So you see how a just individual, if he's a just father, you will find that he will be a successful father. He will have all of his kids and his family love him because he's just. If he's in a polygamous relationship and he is just, even though the wives may be at each other, or maybe they are jealous or whatnot, but yet at the end of the day, because of his justice, they will go ahead and love him, because that is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make it. If he's an employer and he's just and he doesn't get his emotions involved, oh, okay, this person, he's my favorite, or she's my wife, so I have to treat her properly or more better, or whatever it is. He doesn't get his emotions, or he doesn't do injustice, for example. He doesn't fire someone just because they said something bad to a relative of his, for example. That would be an injustice, even though the relative is at fault. Even though the relative is at fault, you will find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make that person successful and prosperous. And there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that Allah will help a nation. Listen to this carefully. Allah will help a nation, a just nation, even if they are not Muslims. So you see sometimes that the lands of the kuffar, like you will find, for example, Britain or Canada or the US, where they actually render justice to the people. Now, like for example, in Germany, right? In Germany right now, there are cases against individuals for abusing and persecuting some of the weak people in Syria, torturing them. Now they couldn't get that justice in their own so-called Muslim countries, but they're getting it in a non-Muslim country. And look at what kind of development the Muslim countries have, and look at Germany. It's like the heavens and the earth, the sky and the earth. Right? Look at how advanced a country like Germany is. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons we could say is because it's the sense of justice that those people have. Now, if a person is, for example, the chancellor or the minister of parliament, whatever it is, and he will get a ticket if he passed the red light, and a regular individual will get a ticket if he passed the red light. You will find that. I know in the US that the police will give a ticket even to the mayor if he broke the law. They would go ahead and investigate those individuals. There's people who are like governors and senators. They would be investigated if they broke the law. Right? We have the president of the US being investigated and trying to be removed because, but of course there's other politics. The point I'm making is the sense of justice is more higher over there, and that is why I believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is helping them to prosper. Whereas in the Muslim country, you don't have that justice. We have inequality, we have injustice that's happening, where the strong devours the weak, where the rich eats the wealth of the poor, whether that is through not paying zakah or taking his wealth or stealing it, whatever it is. So you have, and look, if a oppressed person, Allah, the Prophet ﷺ says, Allah will never bless a nation. Allah will never bless a nation in which the oppressed cannot seek justice. It's hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Allah will never bless a nation in which the oppressed cannot seek justice. And that's what's happening. As look at how much wealth some of the Muslim countries have. Look at how much, but look at how backwards they are. Look at how backwards they are, both in terms of their civil society, in terms of their development. Look at how much wealth some of the it's just amazing. Still, they're living in with sand, and they can't. Anyway, the point I'm making is that this was the factor, the number one factor that the Prophet ﷺ took into consideration. Took into consideration when advising the Sahaba. He didn't throw them into another pit where they would be persecuted more. He made sure he had correspondence with that king, actually. So he knew about that king. Okay. He knew about that king. So the Prophet ﷺ, the number one thing was, even he was a non-Muslim, by the way. The king of Aksum was a non-Muslim. He was not a Muslim at the time. Now, the other reason Abyssinia, Habasha, or Aksum, the Prophet ﷺ chose, because it was familiar to the people of Quraysh, because of the trading that would happen between them. So it wasn't as if the Prophet ﷺ told them to go to, for example, South Africa, or go to Europe, or go to China, because that was not something that the Arabs or the Quraysh knew. The Quraysh, let me just give you just a little. The Quraysh, they knew Yemen. They knew this part right here, Bahrain. They knew the Byzantine Empire, but up until here. And they knew this place because it's very close. So this was their world right here. That's it. This was their world. And that's where people would come from, these different parts over here to Mecca. So they had correspondence, and they had business with those individuals. And back to, I think it was this. Okay. So Abyssinia was something that was familiar to the people of Quraysh. Now, the other reason the Prophet ﷺ chose Abyssinia was because of its easy passage. It only took, for example, about 2 days. It only took about 2 days to get there. Unlike, going to Yemen, for example, unlike going to the north. It would take about a day or so to go to Jeddah, and then it would take about another day or so in order for them to reach Abyssinia. It takes about 1 day to travel by camel and foot to Jeddah, and then from here they would travel probably a few hours up until here, or half a day here, and then come here another half a day. So it took them about 2 or 3 days. It took them about 2 or 3 days to travel to Abyssinia, and that was something very, very manageable. Now, the other reason the Prophet ﷺ chose Abyssinia was that the people of Aksum or Ethiopia, they were Christians, and they are Christians up until now. And they were not mushrikeen. So the Christians are much closer to Islam and the Muslims than the mushrikeen are. Why? Because we have very similar beliefs. For example, we believe in Allah. They also believe in one Allah, in one God. We believe in the prophets, and they also believed in the prophets, such as Dawood and Sulaiman and Musa alayhi salam. So there are many commonalities between the Christians and the Muslims. And in fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in chapter 5, verse 82, that you will find the nearest of the people in affection to the believers are the Christians. Allah, He says in chapter 5, verse 82, that the people who are the closest to the believers, meaning in terms of affection, also in terms of belief, is the Christians. And also in terms of time, because they were the last ideology or the last so-called religion to appear before the Prophet ﷺ came with his message. So you will find, as compared to the Jews, for example, as compared to the Jews, the Christians are someone who are more similar to the Muslims, especially the Unitarian Christians, whom Najashi was a part of. Those Christians that believed in, that did not believe in the Trinity. They did not believe that God was one of three, but rather they were Unitarians. They believed in the divinity, or rather in the prophethood of Isa alayhi salam. They believed in that. So those were what nowadays they're called Unitarian Christians, but back in the days they were called Jewish Christians. If you remember, I think that was the first or the second lesson we ever had of our Seerah. They were called the Jewish Christians or Masonic Jews. They believed Jesus was a prophet. And these were the real Muslims. But they were very few in number, by the way. The Roman Christians actually would persecute them. They would actually have crusades against them. They would actually burn them. The Roman Christians, the Roman Christians, okay, remember the Roman Christians were based upon Paul's Christianity, who came hundreds, I think 300 years after the death of, or rather, after Isa alayhi salam. Okay? So those Christians that believed in the unit, or that believed in the oneness of Allah and that believed in the prophethood of Jesus, they were actually Muslims. Now the Pauline Christians, right, those at that time, they were considered Pauline Christians because those were the Christians that followed Paul. And Paul was an apostle. He was someone who claimed to be the disciple of Jesus, who claimed to be a Christian, but he was not. He was actually a pagan, and he wanted to destroy Christianity from within the Muslims. Right? So these Pauline Christians, they said Jesus, of course, was the Son of God, and they abrogated the laws of Isa alayhi salam. And Trinity was added to their belief, even though actually Paul never preached that. Right? So now what happened is these Muslims, they were in, let me share the screen again. These Muslims were in Now, one other question I wanted to ask: why leave your country? You know, it is not something that is very easy for at that time. Unlike now, now you just pick up your bags. You don't know anyone. You go to that country. You make new friends. Sorry, you make new friends, and that's it. At that time, you had a tribe. You had protection. You had a you had roots there. So if you go to a different country that also was based on tribes, it is very, very hard for you to survive. Now we are all in a melting pot world. We are in a one village. The whole world has become one village. Where actually people, they move around for work very easily. They move around for commercial, for financial reasons. So it's something. We don't have tribalism like they did in the past. So something was very, very difficult, but they had to do it in order to protect their iman and their religion. They had to do it. So then, after they were gone, after they were gone, just within a matter of a few weeks or a few months, there was a rumor, and that rumor was that all of Mecca had become Muslim. Okay, all of Mecca had become Muslim. And that happened in the month of Shawwal. So remember we said that they migrated in Rajab, which was 2 months before Ramadan. Now they have Shawwal. So it's within 3 months. Within 3 months. So they immigrated in Rajab, but they came back just in 3 months. Now, these 15 or 16 Sahabah who immigrated, they were all coming back because of one rumor. And this was a very, very famous incident that happened. It was a very famous incident that happened. And that was the incident in Islam. It's called the story of Gharaniq, the story of Gharaniq. Okay? But in the Western academia or in Western literature, it's known as the Satanic verses. Now, this was an incident in which Surah 2 in chapter 53. Chapter 53. Let's go to chapter 53. Chapter 53 was revealed. Chapter 53 was a very, very powerful surah, very powerful chapter that was revealed, in which the Prophet ﷺ, he recited this in its entirety. And this was one of those surahs that was revealed completely. And so the Prophet ﷺ, when he recited this, at the end of the surah, there is a command for everyone to prostrate. So all of Mecca, when they were hearing this, including the mushrikeen, they all fell down in prostration. So you could see how this was an exaggeration of the event that took place, and everyone said that Mecca had become Muslim. And by the time it reached, by the time it reached the people in Abyssinia, they thought all of Mecca had become Muslim. They packed up their bags and they all came back to Mecca, saying, "Khalas, why do we need to be in a foreign land when our own country has accepted Islam? Now we can go ahead and practice Islam." Okay? But there's an incident that took place, and many people have written about this, both Islamic scholars as well as Oriental scholars. Now there are three, and this incident is famously known by some, especially in Western academia, as the Satanic verses. Satanic verses. Now, there is no such thing as the concept of the Satanic verses in Islam. Now, I'm referring to it as Satanic verses is because that is what Western Oriental scholars, they will use that to refer to this incident. Now, let me go ahead. This so-called Satanic verses, it has 3 versions, and I will go ahead and share with you these 3 versions, what occurred, and then I will tell you which one is, or you will find out actually which one is the most correct or the authentic one. So the first version of this is reported in Sahih al-Bukhari, which is the most authentic book of hadith. And it says in this hadith that in the month of Ramadan, okay, in the 5th year of the da'wah, the Prophet ﷺ, he recited Surah An-Najm. This is called Surah An-Najm in its entirety. And it's a very, very powerful and eloquent surah. Even when you look at it and the way it rhymes. وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ وَمَا غَوَى وَمَا يَنطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَى عَلَّمَهُ شَدِيدُ الْقُوَى ذُو مِرَّةٍ فَاسْتَوَى وَهُوَ بِالْأُفُقِ الْأَعْلَى ثُمَّ دَنَا فَتَدَلَّى فكان قاب قوسين أو أدنى فأوحى إلى عبده ما أوحى. It's something that's very rhythmic and something very, very powerful in it as well. The message that it contains. So when the Prophet ﷺ started to recite this very loudly in Mecca in front of the Kaaba, everyone was memorized by its rhythm. And he even mentioned, which I will come to, he mentions some of their gods in there. All right. So this is a very powerful and eloquent surah. And the Prophet ﷺ, he's building a kind of momentum and excitement in the listeners' hearts. And the power of the Quran, is such that it affected the whole congregation, both Muslims and non-Muslims. So that way, when the Prophet ﷺ, he recited the end of the surah, which is that everyone should, where it says, فَاسْجُدُوا لِلَّهِ وَاعْبُدُوا. So go ahead and prostrate to Allah and worship Him. Everyone prostrated, right? So I'm mentioning version 1, which is in Bukhari, that the Prophet ﷺ, he was reciting Surah An-Najm, and when he came to the end of the verse, he says, فَاسْجُدُوا لِلَّهِ وَاعْبُدُوا, prostrate to Allah and worship Him. Everyone prostrated and fell down in sajda. The Muslims and even the Quraysh, even the non-Muslims. Except for one individual, Al-Walid ibn Mughira, he took some dirt and he just rubbed it on his forehead and he said, this is good enough for me. He says, this is good enough for me. So you can imagine how this rumor was exaggerated, that everyone, look, they had accepted Islam. But they did not accept Islam. Rather, they just, when the verse said prostrate, the whole surah was just developing that momentum, was such a powerful message. Let's just look at some of those verses very briefly. Let's turn to chapter 53, verse 36. Okay. Now I would like to go ahead and recite it. Recite the actual Quran, and I want you guys to follow up with 62. I'll recite. I want to recite the Arabic part, just because I want you guys to feel that power. This is one of my favorite surahs. I recite this in my personal salah very, very often. I would say probably every day. This is one of my favorite surahs. And then you guys can just go ahead and follow along with the translation of it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, أَمْ لَمْ يُنَبَّأْ بِمَا فِي صُحُفِ مُوسَى وَإِبْرَاهِيمَ الَّذِي وَفَّى أَلَّا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى وَأَن لَّيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَىٰ وَأَنَّ سَعْيَهُ سَوْفَ يُرَىٰ ثُمَّ يُجْزَاهُ الْجَزَاءَ الْأَوْفَىٰ وأن إلى ربك المنتهى وأنه هو أضحك وأبكى وأنه هو أمات وأحيا وأنه خلق الزوجين الذكر والأنثى من نطفة إذا تمنى وأن عليه النشأة الأخرى وأنه هو أغنى وأقنى وأنه هو رب الشعرى وأنه أهلك عادا الأولى وثمود فما أبقى وقوم نوح من قبل إنهم كانوا هم أظلم وأطغى والمؤتفكة أهوى فغشاها ما غشى فبأي آلاء ربك تتمارى هذا نذير من النذر الأولى أزفت الآزفة ليس لها من دون الله كاشفة أفمن هذا الحديث تعجبون وتضحكون ولا تبكون وأنتم سامدون فاسجدوا لله واعبدوا. So over here Allah, he's saying to them, and at this statement do you wonder and you laugh and you do not weep while you are proudly sporting? So prostrate to Allah and worship. You could imagine how the Prophet ﷺ, he's reciting these verses with his own beautiful voice. And he's talking about some of the things that those people that they could relate to. And then with powerful command, he says, so prostrate to Allah and worship. So the Muslims, they all fell down. And when the Quraysh, the non-Muslims, the mushrikeen, when they saw the Muslims falling down, they all fell down. And they made sajda to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now this became exaggerated, and everyone said that they had become Muslim, and this reached the Muslims in Abyssinia. Now there is no mention of shaitan. Okay. Now version 2 of this particular story is that when the Prophet ﷺ, he was reciting this, I just want you guys to bear with me. When the Prophet ﷺ, he's reciting these verses, he's talking about, some of them, he's talking about their gods, Lat and Uzza and Manat. So look, he says, he certainly saw of the greatest signs of his Lord. أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ اللَّاتَ وَالْعُزَّى. So have you considered Al-Lat and Al-Uzza? These are the two gods. وَمَنَاتَ الثَّالِثَةَ الْأُخْرَى, and Manat, The third, the other one. Is the male for you and for him, meaning Allah, the female? Then that is an unjust division. Okay? So over here, version 2 says that after this verse, Shaitan, he had injected or he cried out. He added 2 verses that were not in the Quran, and these 2 verses were heard by the mushrikeen, but not the believers. So Shaitan cried out in his own voice, and he added 2 verses. So when the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned, and have you not seen Al-Lat and Al-Uzza, and the third, meaning the other one, the third, and Manat, the third, the other one. So after the Prophet ﷺ said, have you not seen Al-Lat and Al-Uzza and also Al-Manat? Have you not seen Manat? So Shaitan, he added, these idols are the mighty cranes, and their request will be granted. So he added that these 3, they're mighty cranes. What are mighty cranes? These are birds right here. This is how they look like. So you could call them like peacocks or cranes. Okay, and that's why the verse was actually called the verses of Gharaniq. That's why I put down over here the story of Gharaniq or Gharaniq. Okay. They weren't called the Shaitanic verses or Satanic verses. So the second version of the story says that after verse 20, where the Quran was talking about the 3 idols, Al-Lat, Uzza, and Manat, Shaitan had actually inserted 2 verses from his own, but only the non-Muslims heard it, and the Muslims, they did not hear it. So now, this is the first time the idols were being praised, apparently. That these idols are like beautiful birds, cranes, that you should worship them as and your intercession will be accepted. And so when the mushrikeens, the Quraysh, when they heard these verses, they thought, finally the Prophet ﷺ, finally Muhammad, he has come to the middle ground. Remember? We mentioned how the revelation of Qul Ya Ayyuhal Kafirun, that was what they wanted from the Prophet. That come to the middle ground. 1 year we will worship your God, 1 year you worship our God. We believe in Allah anyways. We don't have a problem worshiping Allah. So why are you having a problem with worshiping our gods? So finally, so they said, finally he has come. Finally he has come to the middle ground, the ground that we always wanted him to have. So he's willing to accept our gods finally, and that is why they all prostrated. They all prostrated because they were saying, well, he has come to our, so now we're all going to prostrate. So the Prophet ﷺ, so this is version 2. So when the Prophet ﷺ prostrated, they all prostrated with him. So far, so good. Now, version 3 of the story is even more scarier. But by the way, only version 1 is the most authentic. Version 2 and 3, they don't even, forget about primary source. They don't even come from secondary source. They come from tertiary sources. Remember I mentioned the sources? Sources are very, very important in Islam. So the primary source in the Quran, the primary source in Islam is what? Quran, Hadith, ijma', which means consensus of the scholars. Okay, these are the primary sources. Quran, Hadith. So Bukhari, he's a primary source because that is a hadith of because in it contains authentic narrations of the Prophet ﷺ. So they are a primary source. A secondary source would be like, for example, if a person wanted to quote Bukhari, and then he would go ahead and put his interpretation of it. So he said, well, this is what it means. So that would be called a secondary source. Now this version 2 and version 3 came not even from the secondary source, but it came from tertiary sources. So you could imagine how obscure those sources are and how inauthentic. But still, I have to mention it because this is something when I used to teach Seerah before, I used to get this question. And also Western individuals, Western scholars are actually promoting this. And that's why we have, for example, Salman al-Rushdie or Salman Rushdie in the UK. He came out with a book called the Satanic Verses, referring to this incident actually. So the version 2, okay? Version 2 is where when the Prophet ﷺ, he is reciting these verses. Actually, Shaitan, he went ahead and he put in his tongue, in his mouth, these 2 verses that I mentioned earlier. So Jibreel alayhi salam, he comes and he tells the Prophet, I didn't reveal these 2 verses to you. Why did you recite them? So over here, we have this accusation where the Prophet, he's actually confused. And Shaitan, he succeeds in deceiving the Prophet. And so the Prophet, he recites these verses, but then Allah, through Jibreel, he corrects these verses. So you could see where this becomes problematic, where now the Western Orientalists, they will go ahead and jump on this and say, look, Quran is something that goes off of the whims of the Prophet ﷺ. It can be changed. Look, even Shaitan can go ahead and trick the Prophet ﷺ. Right? So now you have these 2 verses, and Jibreel is actually coming to him and correcting him and saying, I never revealed these 2 verses. And the Prophet ﷺ, he becomes so depressed and hurt, thinking that he invented these. And so Allah, he revealed chapter 22, verse 52. Chapter 22, verse 52. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, and we did not send before you any messenger or prophet except that when he spoke or recited, Shaitan threw in to it some misunderstanding. So let's not read the quotation because it's not part of the Quran. Shaitan threw into it, but Allah abolishes that which Shaitan throws in. Then Allah makes precise his verse, and Allah, he is all-knowing, all-wise. So you see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he corrected this mistake of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in another translation, Shaitan, he threw some falsehood in it, but Allah abolishes that. So you have version 3, which is actually, and this is being propagated by some even Islamic scholars. And they say that even though these hadith or these stories are all weak, but if you were to put them all together, then they actually attain the um, the level of authenticity because they corroborate one another. Now, I'm not going to go into the scholarly argument with regards to this. My point is to bring this up to you guys and explain to you these three versions. And we know version 1, which does not even mention shaitanic verses. It just mentions that the people were so mesmerized by the recitation of the Prophet ﷺ, but also the message that contained within it, that at the end when it said prostrate and worship Allah, they all prostrated to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And version 2 is a little bit more, someone could digest it, but version 3 is completely. So you have some scholars who said this is complete fabrication. How could the Prophet ﷺ invent 2 verses? How could he even be tricked by shaitan? How could Allah even allow him to be tricked? So these 2 verses, the Prophet never ever recited. It was never part of the Quran. Then they were asked, well, how do you explain chapter 22, verse 52, where Allah, he said, but when he did recite, meaning when the messenger or prophet, when they did recite the revelation, shaitan threw into it some things. What does that mean? How can you explain that? So let's say, the satanic verses never took place, right? But how would you go ahead and explain this where Allah, he says in the Quran, never did we send a messenger or a prophet before you. So Allah, he's telling the Prophet Muhammad that, O Prophet of Allah, O Muhammad, don't grieve, because what happened to you happened to the other prophets as well. So never did we send a messenger or a prophet before you, except that when he spoke or when he recited the revelation, shaitan threw into it. So this would suggest that it also happened to the other prophets, that shaitan threw into some of it, and then later on Allah will go ahead and abolish that which shaitan threw. So then that means there are certain verses, at least there was certain verses in the Quran that were so-called satanic, because now how do we know? Is this from shaitan or is this from Jibreel? Is everyone with me? Now, actually, so some of the scholars, they said this verse has nothing to do with the satanic verses. It has nothing to do with that event. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he is saying here is that anytime the prophets, whenever they used to recite the verses of Allah to the people, shaitan would go ahead and throw misunderstanding in the heart of the people. He would throw in a false interpretation of those verses in the hearts of the people. And it happens even up until now. You may hear a verse and then you will have shaitan throw in some wrong interpretation into your heart that is actually completely off. That's why we are not allowed to interpret the Quran according to our own understanding. So that is what it means. So at the time of the Prophet, you will find some people, they would be they would misunderstand a verse. They would misunderstand a particular verse. So then Allah, he would abolish that misunderstanding by bringing down another verse in order to explain any ambiguity in the first verse. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, for example, about fasting, that if, then he would bring about other verses to explain the first verse, or to even abrogate the first verse about people that they don't have to fast when they are traveling, and how they can make up for it. So in the first verses, there was some ambiguity. Or for example, tahajjud. And there are many other, or the iddah of a woman. Okay, what about the iddah of a pregnant woman? If she is divorced, or if her husband dies, she becomes a widow. So Allah would go ahead and bring down other verses to explain that. So Allah would abolish any of the misunderstanding that Shaitan threw into the hearts of people when a particular verse was revealed, in order for Allah to establish His revelation, to make precise His revelation. And this was a test for the people. And this was a kind of test for the people. Why couldn't Allah do that from the very beginning? Why couldn't Allah explain that from the very beginning, instead of leaving people to go ahead? Now, these kinds of what if, that is where the test comes in, and that is where the fitna comes in. Through this Quran, Allah, He guides some people, and through the same book, Allah, He misguides many others as well. Okay, let me see if there is questions. Do we still have Unitarian Christians? Yes, we still have. They're called Unitarian Christians. Okay. So is there any so there is no authentic hadith or incident or report about these so-called shaitanic or satanic verses. There is none. So these Orientalists, they like to always, get these things from tertiary sources and expand that and bring doubts into the hearts of the people. All right. So I mentioned this. Is there any questions?
There was one more question in the chat about your mention that Allah loves a just nation even if they are not Muslims, and one sister asked whether you can give reference for this.
Yeah, inshallah, I'll give reference.
Okay.
I don't have it at hand right now, but if you type, I'll go ahead and give it to you. Any other question? All right.
Assalamualaikum, Sheikh.
Yes, walaikum salam.
Yeah, I have a short question. So means that after 3 months, once this first reveal, and then it's make like a dub of the people or of the Muslim that caused them to move back to Makkah, or how is it? How exactly related to this first reveal to the migration, or to the people who did migrate and then come back to Makkah?
I don't understand. Can you say it again?
I mean, like, what is exactly relation between the people who did migrate to have Abashi to the somewhere in Ethiopia? What is the name again?
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, because after 3 months they came back to Makkah, right?
Yeah.
So what is the exactly relations to them come back to Makkah with these verse revelations?
Okay, so when they went to Abyssinia for their first migration, they heard a rumor that the people of Mecca had all accepted Islam. And the reason that they had accepted Islam is because of these verses that I had just recited, chapter 52. So these verses were revealed, and they all started making sajda, because at the end I mentioned why they made sajda. So this went back to the people, Muslims living in Abyssinia, that hey, Surah An-Najm was revealed and people all accepted Islam, and they took this and said, well, what are we doing here? Let's go back to our country, because now we left our country because the mushrikeen were persecuting us, they were torturing us. So now they have become Muslim. Let's go to them. Let's go back to our houses. Let's go back to our homeland. Why should we be in a foreign country where we have, even though we have justice and everything, but we're feeling alone here? So that's why they went, because of this incident. But when they went there, when they reached Jeddah, they asked the people, okay? They asked, did the people of Mecca become Muslim? They asked the tribes surrounding Mecca. They said no. They still are the way they are. So when they reached the outskirts, they said, hey, did the people become Muslim? They said no, they are the way they are, the way you left them. And that made them very, very sad. So some of them said, well, let's go back. We came here because of this rumor. Let's go back. But then others said, no, we are so close to our home. Let's go visit some of our relatives. Let's go and visit our homes. And then we can go back if we want to go back later on. So they decided, we are so close to Mecca, let's just go. And we'll go, and then, if we want, some of us, we can go back to and leave. All right. So when they went to Mecca, they found that the rumor was actually false, that no one had actually accepted Islam, and that the situation in Mecca was the same, and the Quraysh continued to torture and persecute the Muslims.
It's kind of trap, right? This rumor is kind of trap for the Muslims.
Yeah, this rumor was wrong, was false. Now, also in Mecca, during that 3-month period, the Muslims in Mecca, they were receiving the good news of the Muslims in Abyssinia, that how much freedom they have, how much safety, they had food, they had safety in Abyssinia. And so a large number of Muslims in Mecca actually wanted to migrate to Abyssinia. A large number of Muslims. So almost like 100, 80, like 80 to 100. 80 to 100. So when the people of Abyssinia, the Muslims of Abyssinia, when they came back to Mecca and they found that everything was false, it gave those Muslims in Mecca a reason to actually migrate. Do you guys understand? because now they have people. It's like Brother Rene or like me or Sister Maria. If we go back to our home country and we say, yeah, Malaysia was so nice and we have so many opportunities and all of that good stuff, and then the people who are actually from amongst our friends and family that wanted to leave, like, okay, yeah, okay, we will follow you, because they're looking for people who have actually been to a country, and they're looking for that push. So when the people came back from Abyssinia to Mecca, but then they realized everything was false, now they want to go back. Now there's more people. Even before, they wanted to migrate, but they just didn't have that courage. They didn't have that guide to migrate. When they found these people are going back, they said, we are joining you too. So now you have the second migration, you have a much larger number. Now remember, I mentioned this before. There's only about 200, at this time, there's only about 130 Muslims, 200 Muslims, okay? And the population of Mecca is about 1,000. Anywhere from 900 to 1,000. You can imagine 10% of Mecca is already migrating. That's a big number. That's like more than 100 people are migrating. That's a huge number. 10, 12%. It's like Malaysia, you have about 3.5 million people migrating. That's going to be a huge number. With their wealth, for example, with their bank account. What do you think that's going to do to Bank Negara? So the Quraysh, they did not like this. So they went and they decided to send first they tried to actually prevent them. But these people had already left. The Muslims had already left through the port, so they could not catch up to them. So now they sent ambassadors or a delegate to Abyssinia. And one of them was Amr ibn al-As. Now remember this name, Amr ibn al-As. He was a very, very smart individual. He was someone who was a politician, someone who was just extremely, extremely like an ambassador for Quraysh. He was well-versed, well-spoken. He was very smart. He had not accepted Islam except 3 years before, 2 or 3 years before the conquest of Mecca. So he was someone who was, for the most part, a non-Muslim during his life. But when he became a Muslim, he was actually very, very beneficial for the Muslims. So he was sent as a delegate on behalf of the Quraysh in order to convince the people, the government of Najashi, the government of Habasha, to hand over these people, because they were so full of hatred towards the Muslim that they could not handle to hear that, look, these people are enjoying their lives. That's how much the Quraysh hated the Muslims. They didn't even wish well for them. They felt that, look, if you cannot live in peace in Mecca, you cannot live in peace anywhere else. If we are not going to let you practice your new religion, then we're not going to let you practice it anywhere else. We're not going to let you practice it anywhere else. And this is one of the tactics that's being used even up until now. So what happened is Amr ibn al-As, okay, he went with so many gifts to go ahead and try to lobby some of the ministers. And he presented, for example, some of the courtsmen of Najashi, and even give Najashi gifts as well. And this tells us, gifts or bribery, this tells us one of the concepts. What they were doing was basically, in our time, it's called lobbying. Have you guys heard of lobbying before? Something very, very common in the US. Right? Lobbying. That's what they were doing. Now, the concept of lobbying in Islam is haram. You cannot lobby. You cannot go ahead and pay a person, a government employee, whether that is through campaign contribution, whether it is contributing to one of his causes, whatever it is. If he's a government employee, he is not allowed to get anything of business contracts or anything of financial financial contribution. That is 100% haram in Islam. In Islam, in Islamic governance, good governance, we have a whole genre of Islamic studies that has to do with Islamic governance, and that is, you could either choose to be a politician, meaning you can either choose to be in government, a government servant, or you can choose to be a business individual. You cannot mix these two. In Islam, you cannot mix these two. Meaning, if you are a government servant, you cannot do business at all. And if you are a businessman, you cannot put your hand in politics, because that's where corruption will come. If you are someone that politics and government interests you, you have to wash your hands from business. But now look at what's happening. Where are all the major contracts going to? Are people who are actually in politics. Who is controlling all of these big contracts? Who's building the roads? Who's doing this? And that is where corruption comes. That's why you will have only the people in position of power being rich, whereas the regular masses are suffering and they are working at a minimum wage. If the markets are truly free, then guess who the government? I would do it for 1/10 the price. Those people are doing. That's why you will find, for example, something as simple as a project to build, 1 kilometer of road shouldn't cost more than 1 million ringgits. Somehow it ends up costing 100 million ringgits. And you're wondering, where's all the expenses? The poor migrant workers are only getting paid 50 to 100 ringgits a day. How is that possible? Because they're the only bidders. They say, all right, I'm going to charge myself, because I'm the minister of finance and treasury, and I'm the minister of this. I'm going to go ahead and charge, and I'm going to approve it, and I'm going to give a few to my friends so that way they can not speak out. Now, up to a certain degree, you have this Islamic governance or principle of governance in the Western countries. And that's why their corruption is at a minimum. Yes, of course, they have corruption, but it is not like it is in, for example, in some of the Scandinavian countries. You can't even have anyone contributing to your political campaign. You cannot have, if you are a politician, you cannot mix these two. I mean, they do it, of course, some of them get away with it, but if it's found out, then they have to resign. So the point I was making is that you have Amr ibn al-As, he's going to these ministers of Abyssinia and he's lobbying them and he's giving them these gifts and he's telling them, please hand over, because tomorrow when we go to the king, please convince the king to hand over some of our people that came and sought refuge in your country. So they agreed with Amr ibn al-As that this is what we're going to do. So the next day, they went to Najashi. Now Najashi, his name, anyone know his real name? Anyone? Okay, let me show you. Najashi, his real name was Ashama ibn Abjar. And let me just share with you. I mean, his grave is still well known. It exists even now. I'm trying to find something here. Right here. So this is something very, very, I mean, this is where he's buried. Okay. So he's, this is, you could call it a mausoleum, or this is where he is buried. Very common, this is in Ethiopia. Right. So his name is Ashama ibn Abja. They called him Najashi because that was his title. Just like how prime minister or chancellor or president or Caesar or, you know, whatever they had in other parts of the world. Emperor. So Najashi was a title. They called him Negus in English. So they went to Najashi and they said to him, some foolish youth from amongst our nation, our people, are in your country, and they invented a new religion. They've left ours and they neither embraced yours. They left our religion and they came to your country, but they are not even accepting your religion. And the leaders of us have sent us, meaning our chieftains in Mecca, they sent me to you so you can hand over these young, foolish people back to us. You see some of the words that he is using? First, he's trying to bribe Najashi and his ministers. Then he is threatening Najashi with religious, social, and political words and differences. So they are saying a bunch of youngsters, meaning these are just people on the street. The youngsters, they don't have any intellect. They have broken away from they are outcasts. You see how words they are using? And it reminds me about how, you know, the media, some of the words that they use against the Muslims. Anytime something happens, a Muslim is involved in something, they will go ahead and say Islamic fundamentalists or Muslim terrorists and extremists and mass murderers. And then when a Christian or when he has some mental problems, and they would always send they will use pictures of him with his kids. They will use pictures, like for example, when a soldier in Israel dies, or rather when he commits an act of aggression against the population, against the civilians in Gaza, they will always show him with his family and kids or whatever it is. But then when a Muslim, when they're showing that, they will show him with the RPG or with a gun. Ooh, that's something very scary. So they use that. And have you ever noticed they will never mention the name of a Muslim when they die? Because they even want to go ahead and not even give him the honor of mentioning his name. Whereas when one of them dies, they will go ahead and mention his name and which neighborhood he lived in and what was the name of his dog and which school he went to and his family and everything. Even the name of his cat, they will mention. But when a Muslim, it's just a number. 13 Muslims were killed. That's it. It's just a number. And then when one of these people die, they will mention 13 years of his history. And they will talk about it for 13 minutes. So you will find even the media using the same tactics against the Muslims. So basically they are threatening Najashi that look, you have these outcasts, these people who are committing mischief in our country. They're coming to your country and they're going to do the same thing if you don't hand them over to us. That's what they're saying. So the ministers, they all stood up and they said, "Oh, our ruler, oh, our king, what they say is making sense, so go ahead and hand them back to their people." By the way, why do we have to worry about their problems? It shouldn't be our problem. It's their problem. Came here. Of course, these ministers were told to say this because they were given some lavish gifts by these delegates of Makkah. So they said, it shouldn't be our problem. It's their problem. Give them back. So they all agreed. So Najashi, now remember, I mentioned the number one quality of his was that he was a just king. He said, "No, by Allah, I cannot hand them back after they have chosen my land." Now, what does that mean? What it means is that I will not return them back until I hear them and their side of the story, especially since they chose my country over all the other countries. There must be a reason they chose my country. There must be a reason. Look, they chose my country over all the other countries. So he took that into account, that because of the prosperity that I have to offer, the security and the justice, they chose that. So I'm not going to hand them over. Because what is that going to say about my country to other people who want to settle down in my country? So the Muslims, I forgot to mention the second migration was led by the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ and the brother of Ali radiallahu anhu and the son of Abu Talib, and his name was Ja'far ibn Abi Talib. He was the leader of the Muslims in the second migration. So when he got summoned to the court of the king, along with the Muslims or some of the Muslims, they were actually very anxious and they didn't know. And they were very anxious and they didn't know what to say But Ja'far, he said, we will speak the truth and only say what our Prophet told us to say. So when they arrived at the palace and they found Najashi surrounded by his courtsmen and by his ministers, and he also found Amr ibn al-As, they knew Amr from back in the days of Mecca. They knew how what kind of a politician he was. So they knew that he was up to no good. What did they say to Najashi about them? So when everyone entered Najashi, everyone bowed to Najashi, except for the Muslims. And the ministers, they objected to that. And they said, look, everyone has to bow down to Najashi. And how dare you guys walk in without prostrating or bowing down to Najashi? Now, subhanAllah, if you look at this, you will find that at a time when their life and their fate is hanging in the balance, yet they did not compromise in their religion. Because to bow down or to prostrate to anyone other than Allah, it is strictly, it's haram. You can't, it leads a person outside of Islam if you prostrate to someone else out of worship. You can't. So they, even though their life was hanging in the balance and they knew that they weren't going to compromise on this aspect of Islam. This wasn't an issue they could compromise, even though they were in a state of weakness. So when it was objected to them, Ja'far says, our Prophet has told us we can only prostrate to our Lord. So Najashi, he asked them, tell me about your new religion. Why did you leave the religion of your people, of your tribe? And why did you not become a Christian or a Jew? So you see how Najashi is saying, why did you leave your religion? And when you left it, why didn't you become a Christian or a Jew? And so Ja'far, he gave them a response which was the pinnacle of eloquence. He said, O Najashi, O king, we used to be a nation who was in ignorance. We used to worship idols. We would eat dead meat, and we would perform all kinds of immoral acts. We would break the ties of kinship. We treated our neighbors in contempt. The strong amongst us would eat up and devour the weak, and we remained in this state until Allah sent a messenger to us. This messenger was known to us. He is from our community. We know his house and we know his lineage, and we know his truthfulness, and he never spoke a lie in his life. And he invited us to believe in one God alone and to leave the worshipping of idols. He told us to abandon the ways of our forefathers and to leave the worship of stones and statues. And he commanded us to be true when we speak and to fulfill our promises and to fulfill the ties of kinship, and told us to be good to our neighbors, and he commanded us to avoid all evil. He told us not to spill blood, to give true testimony. He forbade us from eating the wealth of the orphans. He forbade us from accusing others of adultery. And he commanded us to worship Allah alone without associating anything with him. He told us to pray, to fast, to give charity. So we believed in him, and we followed him, and we brought our faith in him. And we worshiped Allah alone, and we gave up worshiping idols. We forbade upon ourselves everything that he forbade upon us, and we make permissible all that he allowed for us. But our people opposed us, and they showed hatred towards us, and they tortured us, and they punished us, and they tried to force us back into idol worship. And they were unjust to us, and they made life miserable. And they prevented us from being who we are. So when they did this, we immigrated to your land, and we chose you above all the other rulers, and we wish to come under your generosity and hospitality, and we put our trust in you that we would not be shown injustice in your land. This was such a powerful speech by Ja'far radiallahu anhu. Instantly, he put the Muslims in a positive light. So you see how he put the Quraysh in a negative light? They ate dead meat. They weren't good to their families. They weren't good to their relatives. The rich devoured the poor, and they used to do this to the neighbors, and they worshiped things that were idols and stones and statues, which even you as a Christian, you don't even worship those things. We Muslims, look, the Prophet, he said you can't commit adultery because in Christianity it's also forbidden. You can't do this, you can't do that. Like all of these things, which was actually very close to Christianity. So Ja'far radiallahu anhu, not only was he eloquent, but he was very, very smart in using those things that he knew would appeal to the king. And he said they were unjust, meaning this king was just, so he hates injustice. He said they were unjust, and we came here to seek your justice and to live under your just country, civilization. So he puts the Muslims in a positive light, and he puts the Quraysh in a very, very negative light. He explains that they have no laws, and that's true. Quraysh, Makkah, they weren't a law, they weren't a country or a society of law. They were a country or a society of tradition and tribes. And that is what someone he very eloquently put. And that is what exists actually nowadays too, by the way. You will see the Muslim countries, especially the Arabian countries, they are not a country of law. They are a country of society and tribal. And what that means is, even if a person commits murder, he could get away with it through tribalism and through other things. If you want a job in the Arab world, you have to have connection. But if you want, whereas the society and the countries of in the Western world are countries of laws, meaning if you are a prime minister or a regular person on the street, if you kill someone, you will be put in jail. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter who you are. They don't have this tribal stuff. Over there, you don't need connection. I mean, to a certain degree, yeah, you do. But to a large degree, you don't. So if you want to apply for a job, you and 100 other people, and they will look only at your qualification rather than your connections and which tribe you came from. So the society in Quraysh was a society of tribalism and not a society or country of laws. So over here, Ja'far, he's saying, and those people, they don't even have laws, and we came here to live under your just laws. So Najashi, he then asked, he said, do you have any revelation? Do you have anything from your book that you could share with us? Ja'far said, yes. And so Ja'far, he recited Surah Maryam. And that also tells you the level of knowledge of Ja'far. that he is saying those things that is very, very relevant given the circumstance. He's not speaking about some other, I mean, he's not going to recite other, like Surah Fil. He's not going to recite to them, you know, how Allah is cursing Abu Lahab by reciting Tabbat Yada Abi Lahabin wa Tab. He's not going to recite those kinds of verses. He's going to recite those verses in which he knows that Najashi is going to have a common, a commonality and a connection with. And that tells us when we're giving da'wah or when we are teaching, you can't just give examples that are that's not pertinent. You can't give examples that people cannot connect with. And unfortunately, our Islamic institutes or our Islamic books are filled with them. Actually, our Islamic books were written, at least the classical ones, were written at a time in which it was very relevant to that. At least the examples I'm talking about. Now those examples have not changed at all. People are using the same examples. I'm saying go ahead and change those examples to fit our context and leave the core message, you know, and leave the principles. So if you're talking about, for example, wudu, you can't talk about, you know, drawing water from the well. You can't give those examples. That's just not pertinent to our times. So you can bring examples of bottled water. You can bring example of you know, water that has been treated and what is the Islamic ruling of that. Okay, can't bring rainwater and those things. I mean, that's just, or in Islamic criminology, they bring examples which for me didn't make sense. Anyway, so he started to recite Surah Maryam, the one surah that talks about Maryam alayhi salam and Isa alayhi salam. And this goes and everyone is listening to the recitation of Ja'far radiallahu anhu. And it awakens the whole court, and the court is just so emotional at that recitation, to the point where Najashi and his courtsmen are actually crying at the message of what's contained within Surah Maryam. And Najashi, he says, I swear by Allah, this recitation or this message of Musa and Jesus have sprung from the same fountain. It's from the same source. And he said to Amr ibn al-As, the delegates of Quraysh, he says, go away and I will never hand these people over to you. So don't even think about it. And they left. But Amr, he was not done. He said, I have one final trick that I will come back to. So Amr, he's not giving up. Amr, he's not giving up. So he goes back to Najashi and he says to him, he says, do you know what kind of stuff they say about Isa? They are saying blasphemous stuff. Because he knows, okay, I told you, Amr is a very, very smart individual. So he knows, okay, Najashi and them, they are Christians. And if I was to say something about the Muslims that they don't really believe in Isa the way that the Christians believe in Isa, then that will go ahead and convince them to give them up. So now the Muslims were brought up to the court again. And this time they were actually even more anxious because they thought that, you know, all right, everything was done with. And they knew Amr, they knew what he was up to, or rather they knew what he could do to harm them, because that was from their tribe. So they knew the tricks of Amr. So Amr ibn al-As, he says, they say blasphemous things about your God, Jesus. So Najashi, he told the Muslims again to come. And Ja'far, when he was asked, what do you say about Jesus? He said, we say what our prophets told us, that Isa alayhi salam, he was the servant, and he was the slave and the prophet and the word of Allah. He was the slave, the messenger, and the kalima, the word of Allah. His mother was a virgin. Okay. So Ja'far, he didn't go on the offensive, and he didn't say things such as Trinity is blasphemous and the concept of the Son of God is insulting. He didn't go on the offensive. He didn't want to say those things that would actually create more, that would add more fuel to fire. Rather, he says, we say about Jesus that he's this slave and he is the messenger and the word of Allah. So he didn't go and he didn't try to make the matter worse by going on the offensive. So Najashi, he gets the point. So he says, oh, you don't think Jesus is the Son of God? So he reads in between the lines. And the reason he asks this is because Najashi himself doesn't believe in the Trinity. He never believed in the Trinity. He was I mentioned, he was the Jewish Christian. He was the Christian that, a Unitarian Christian. He believed in the prophethood of Jesus, but not in the divinity of Jesus. He never believed Jesus was a son of God. Whereas his courtsmen and his ministers, they believed in the divinity of Jesus and they believed in the Trinity. So when he asked that, he actually didn't believe in the Trinity or in the divinity of Jesus, or Jesus is the Son of God. So he was just trying to show to his courtsmen that, look, there are other people as well that also don't believe in the Trinity. Do you guys understand? So Najashi, he's even more impressed, and he says that this is what he also believes in as well. And the people were actually very, very so he told the Amr once and for all that take your gifts and get out of my court. I will never ever hand these people over to you. Now Najashi he became a Muslim. How do we know he became a Muslim? Is because he wrote a letter to the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, oh, I am a Muslim and I follow you, and if you command, I will come to Medina and I will serve you. So this was a letter to the Prophet ﷺ. Najashi was someone that when he died, the Prophet ﷺ performed Salatul Janaza al-Ghaib, which is the funeral prayer in absentia or in absentia. which means that you could perform the funeral prayer of an individual even though that dead person is not in front of you. Now, there are differences of opinion amongst the scholars whether this is permissible or not. And the differences of opinion mainly surrounds this action of the Prophet, where when Najashi died in Ethiopia, the Prophet ﷺ performed the funeral prayer in Abyssinia all the way in Medina, where he was not in front of him. Now, the scholars, they debated whether this is permissible or not. The ones that said it is permissible, they said it is only permissible when no one else has performed that. So, and that is true with Najashi. Najashi died and there was no one to perform janazah on him, so the Prophet, he performed it. Others said, no, it is permissible in all cases. And that's why you will find, even though, for example, someone who dies, we find this all the time, someone who dies in Kelantan and the masjid already performs the janazah over there, then because he has some connection here and with the masjid here, so he said, my father died in Kelantan, let's all perform it here in Selangor as well. So a masjid will go ahead and perform it. And they will call this the funeral prayer in absentia, meaning in his absence. Now, the Prophet, look at, the Prophet only performed it. This was the first, and this was the only time the Prophet performed it. That he performed it on a person that no one else performed it upon. Why? Because there was no Muslims that performed it on him. Now, Ethiopia was and still remains to a very, very large degree a Christian nation. And Najashi was one of the very few native Muslims. As a matter of fact, there was civil unrest and civil war that broke out in Ethiopia because of a rumor that he had actually become a Muslim. And the Muslims that were living there, they were praying to Allah to give victory to Najashi. Salama, she says, we were making dua, and we made dua like we've never made dua before. We said, oh Allah, allow Najashi to remain in power and give him authority in the earth. So, and Allah accepted their dua, and he won the civil unrest, or he won the civil war that happened in his land. So you could see how the people were actually very, very devout Christians. So they never really accepted Islam the way Arabia and Medina and those people had accepted Islam. All right. So that's why Ethiopia really, I mean, still, it's very, 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 very dominantly Christian. Dominantly Christian. However, the surrounding, and the surprising thing is the surrounding areas is dominantly Muslims, like Sudan, like Somalia. They are very dominant Muslims. All right. Is there any questions? Because then, so the Muslims, they remained in Abyssinia for like 10 to 12 years, even after the Prophet ﷺ migrated to Medina. So like 7 years, even after, 5 years, even after the Prophet migrated to Medina, the Muslims still remained in Abyssinia. So for a total of about 12, 13 years, the Muslims remained in Abyssinia, even though the Prophet had migrated to Medina. And one of the reasons we could say that the Prophet did not order the Muslims from Abyssinia to come and join him in Medina is because the Prophet, he wanted a backup plan. You could say he wanted a backup plan because Medina was still in a time where, you know, you had the Jews trying to fight. You had so many people who were trying to fight the rule of the Prophet ﷺ. And there was many battles that was taking place in Medina. So the Prophet ﷺ, he did not want to bring the people from Abyssinia, the Muslims, to Medina because things were still not very solid for the Muslims. It was only after the Battle of the Trench that after they had won and the Prophet ﷺ solidified his rule in Medina and he exiled the Jews and he killed them and he established his rule, that's when he sent a letter to his cousin Ja'far, come over to Medina now, along with the rest of the Muslims. And this shows you the long-term planning, the strategic planning of the Prophet ﷺ for the Muslims. And so, inshallah, next week we will go ahead and cover the conversion of Hamza radiallahu anhu and also the conversion of Umar radiallahu anhu. But I also wanted to make an announcement, and that announcement is, let me first stop